What if I told you that the greatest story ever told never actually happened? And hold on, before you tune out, I am not talking about the magic tricks. I'm not talking about walking on water, multiplying fish sandwiches to feed a stadium, or saints climbing out of their graves to walk around Jerusalem. As modern rational people, most of us have already filed those stories away under mythology. We know that the laws of physics don't take a day off just because a story needs a twist. No, I'm talking about the man himself. See, usually, even the most skeptical among us have a default setting. We have this mental safety net. We think, okay, sure, the supernatural stuff is nonsense, the miracles are metaphors, but there must have been a guy, right? A wandering rabbi named Yeshua who preached love, pissed off the Roman Empire, got himself killed, and then legends grew over his memory like moss on a stone. That is the historical Jesus theory. It feels safe, it feels reasonable, it feels academic. But my friends, what if that safety net is actually full of holes? What if that assumption is completely, fundamentally wrong? Welcome back. I am Farid, and today we are opening a cold case that is 2,000 years old. We're diving headfirst into the work of historian David Fitzgerald, specifically his groundbreaking book, Nailed: 10 Christian Myths That Show Jesus Never Existed at All. And I want to be clear, Fitzgerald isn't just trying to be edgy. He isn't a conspiracy theorist wearing a tinfoil hat. He points out that 20 years ago, he wouldn't have doubted the existence of a historical Jesus either. It's the default position. But the moment you actually stop trusting the tradition, the moment you stop listening to what people say is in the history books and actually look at the raw data, something scary happens. You realize you aren't looking at a history book. You're looking at a house of cards. We're going to show you why the historical Jesus isn't the real man distorted by legend, but a literary construct built from scratch, a myth. This is the conversation that is waking up the next generation of critical thinkers. So, grab your coffee, find a comfortable spot, and put on your skepticism helmet. We are about to pull the thread that unravels the whole sweater. Let's get into it. If we're going to challenge an assumption that has held for 20 centuries, we have to audit the books. We have to look at the raw data without the rose-colored glasses of tradition. And here's a reality check that most people, even many hard-nosed atheists, aren't ready for. In Nailed, David Fitzgerald doesn't mince words. He looks at the mountain of evidence for a historical Jesus and concludes that, frankly, it is non-existent. Now, I can hear the objection already. You might be thinking, come on, Farid, isn't there a core of truth beneath the legends? This is what scholars often call the onion theory. The idea is that if you peel away the layers of mythology, peel away the virgin birth, peel away the resurrection, peel away the miracles, eventually you will find a solid historical core in the middle, a real guy. But Fitzgerald argues that is the wrong analogy. It's not an onion, it's a sweater. Picture a knitted sweater. You find a loose thread, say a massive contradiction in the timeline. You pull it. Then you find a story that was clearly copied from the Old Testament. You pull that thread too. You keep pulling and pulling, expecting to hit a solid body underneath the wool. But eventually, the yarn runs out. You aren't holding a core, you're just standing there holding a pile of unraveled yarn. There is no sweater. There is no man. Why do we say that? Because when we look for contemporaneous evidence, hard proof from the time he actually lived, we hit a brick wall. Let's look at the inventory. We have zero physical evidence, no archaeology. We have zero writings from Jesus himself. We have zero writings from his enemies during his lifetime. We have zero court records, zero Roman decrees, zero letters. Think about the era we are talking about. The first century wasn't the Dark Ages. The Roman Empire was a bureaucracy obsessed with paperwork. We have tax receipts, we have military orders, we have letters from governors complaining about the weather. We have historians writing detailed accounts of minor Jewish sects and crazy street preachers. And yet, for a man who supposedly broke the laws of physics, drew crowds of thousands, challenged the temple authorities, and got executed by a Roman governor, the history books from his actual lifetime are completely blank. But I can hear you screaming at your screen right now. Farid, we have the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Are those just chopped liver? That is the million-dollar question. If the secular history books are empty, can we trust the religious ones? Let's actually open those books and treat them like evidence in a court of law. If you ask the average believer, or even the average person on the street, they will tell you, well, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were four guys who followed Jesus around. They had notepads. They were eyewitnesses recording history as it happened. That is objectively, provably false. Here is the cold, hard reality that you won't hear in Sunday school. The Gospels are anonymous. We do not know who wrote them. The names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were attached to these scrolls later in the 2nd century to give them authority. Furthermore, they were written generations after the alleged events. They were written in a different language, highly educated Greek, not the Aramaic that a peasant from Galilee would speak. And they were likely written in a different country entirely. These aren't diaries. They are highly edited theological fan fiction. And how do we know they're fiction? Because they don't just disagree on small details. They disagree on the entire plot. Fitzgerald puts it perfectly. We aren't talking about eyewitness discrepancies, like a car crash where one witness says the car was red and another says it was blue. No, we are talking about completely different realities. Let's look at the evolution of the story. The very first gospel written was Mark. Fitzgerald calls this the low-rent, no-frills version. It's simple. Jesus is a suffering prophet. Then Matthew and Luke come along later. They have a copy of Mark in front of them. We know this because they copy him word for word in Greek, but they decide Mark isn't spicy enough. So they add a virgin birth. They add a genealogy. They add more magic. But then you get to the Gospel of John, and the narrative rails snap. Let me give you one devastating example that Fitzgerald highlights. It's the inciting incident. In any story, there is an event that triggers the climax. In the first 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, why is Jesus arrested and crucified? What is the final straw? It's the cleansing of the temple. Jesus goes into the temple, throws a tantrum, flips over the money changers' tables, and causes a riot. That is the crime that gets him killed. But the author of John decides, I don't like that story. In John's version, the temple incident happens years earlier in chapter 2, and nobody cares. He doesn't get arrested, it's a non-event. So in John's version, why does Jesus get killed? What is the final straw? It is because he raised a man named Lazarus from the dead. Think about that for a second. In John, the resurrection of Lazarus, a man who had been rotting in a tomb for 4 days, is the most public, spectacular miracle of Jesus' career. It is the specific reason the authorities decide he has to die. Yet in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Lazarus doesn't exist. He is never mentioned. Now put on your detective hat. If these were eyewitness accounts, how do 3 out of 4 reporters forget to mention the zombie man? How do they miss the single biggest miracle that supposedly got their leader executed? Imagine reading 4 biographies of Abraham Lincoln. 3 of them say he was shot because of the Civil War. The 4th one says, no, he was shot because he brought George Washington back to life using necromancy. Would you say, oh, they just have different perspectives? Or would you say, okay, someone is making this up? They didn't forget, my friends. They were writing literature, not history. And once you realize the Gospels are just competing stories, the evidence evaporates. So the Gospels are out. They are literary fiction. Therefore, apologists, people who defend the faith, have to change the subject. They have to drag the rest of history down to their level. You have definitely heard this argument. It is the favorite gotcha card of the faithful. They say, well, look, the evidence for ancient history is always scarce. If you throw out the evidence for Jesus, you have to throw out the evidence for Julius Caesar. Do you deny Caesar existed? Stop. That is a horrible argument. It is what Fitzgerald calls a bad historicist argument. It sounds smart, but it crumbles the second you touch it. Let's look at the actual data. Let's compare the dossier of Jesus to the dossier of Caesar. For Caesar, we have pillars of evidence. Number 1, physical evidence. We have coins minted at the time with his face on them. We have statues commissioned during his life. Number 2, written evidence from the man himself. Caesar wrote books. We have the Gallic Wars. We know his voice, his style, his thoughts. Number 3, written evidence from his enemies. Cicero, Pompey, Cato, people who hated his guts, wrote about him while he was alive. Number 4, the bare facts of history. The political landscape of Rome changed in a way that is impossible to explain unless Caesar physically crossed a Rubicon. Now, compare that to Jesus. Do we have physical evidence? No. Do we have writings from Jesus? No. Do we have writings from his enemies during his lifetime? No. Do we have anything to corroborate the Gospels during the time they were written? No. As Fitzgerald points out, the only pillar Jesus has is the worst kind of evidence, anonymous religious tracts written generations later to sell a new theology. Comparing the evidence for Caesar to the evidence for Jesus is like comparing a 4K photograph to a rumor about a ghost. They aren't in the same ballpark. They aren't even the same sports. But the believer has one last card to play. They will say, wait, we do have a historian. We have the smoking gun. And they will point to one name, Flavius Josephus. Ah, Josephus, the golden boy of Christian apologetics. He was a Jewish historian living in the 1st century, writing for the Romans. And yes, in his massive book, The Antiquities of the Jews, there is a paragraph about Jesus. But let's be real, that proof is a fraud. There are 2 famous passages in Josephus. The first one is known as the Testimonium Flavianum. In this paragraph, Josephus, who was a strict Orthodox Jew, suddenly breaks character. He starts praising Jesus. He calls him the Messiah. He says he rose from the dead. Come on. If Josephus believed Jesus was the Messiah and rose from the dead, he would have been a Christian. He wasn't. He lived and died a Jew. Even Christian scholars today, people who desperately want this to be true, admit this passage was tampered with. It's a forgery. As Fitzgerald puts it, later Christian scribes found a copy of Josephus that didn't mention Jesus, and they decided to tart it up. They inserted a commercial for their religion into a history book. It's not history, it's vandalism. So, what about the second passage, the one where Josephus mentions a Jesus in passing? Well, if you actually read the context, which apologists rarely do, Josephus isn't talking about Jesus of Nazareth. He identifies the man clearly as Jesus, son of Domnius. That has nothing to do with the Christian Savior. It's a completely different guy with a common name. It's like finding a book mentioning Michael Jordan the accountant and claiming it proves the existence of the basketball star. So, here is the devastating consequence. Once you toss out the Josephus forgeries, what are you left with? You're left with what Fitzgerald calls the silent century. For 100 years, from the alleged birth of Jesus until well into the 2nd century, we have nothing. Not a single historian, not a single politician, not a single philosopher mentions this man. It's not just a gap in the record, my friends, it is a black hole. This brings us to a logical problem. If the history books are empty, where did all the specific details in the Gospels come from? The trial, the crowd shouting, the release of the prisoner. Where did the writers get that? If they didn't get it from reality, they had to get it from literature. And this is where Nailed gets absolutely fascinating. Fitzgerald shows us that the Gospels aren't reporting events. They are remixing the Old Testament. They are writing symbolic code. Let's look closely at the trial of Jesus. It's one of the most famous scenes in history. Pontius Pilate, the ruthless Roman governor, stands before the crowd. He offers to release a prisoner. The crowd chooses a murderer named Barabbas, condemning Jesus to die. Let me stop you right there. That never happened. There is zero record in Roman law or history of governors releasing insurrectionists just because a mob shouted for it. Pilate was a man who slaughtered Jews for sport. The idea that he would let a murderer go because of a Passover custom is historically absurd. But it makes perfect sense if you stop reading it as history and start reading it as an allegory for Yom Kippur. Do you know the Yom Kippur ritual, the Day of Atonement? In the ancient Jewish ritual, the priest takes two goats. One goat is sacrificed to God to pay for the sins of the people. The other goat, the scapegoat, is released into the wild, carrying the sins away. Now, look at the gospel story again. You have Jesus. He is called the Son of the Father. He is the innocent sacrifice. And who is the other guy? Barabbas. Do you know what the name Bar Abbas literally means in Aramaic? Bar means son, Abba means father. Barabbas means son of the father. You have two sons of the father, two goats. One is released, the other is the blood sacrifice. This isn't the court transcript, guys. It's a Yom Kippur remix. The author is taking Jewish rituals and turning them into a narrative story. It is brilliant literature, but it is not history. It didn't happen in a courtyard in Jerusalem. It happened in the mind of a writer constructing a theological puzzle. But it gets worse. You'd think if these were Jewish writers recording real events, they would at least get the Jewish legal system right? Oh boy, do I have news for you. If the trial of Jesus were a real historical event recorded by Jewish eyewitnesses, you would expect them to know, I don't know, how a Jewish trial works. Instead, the Gospels give us a courtroom drama that violates every single law in the book. First, they claim the Sanhedrin, the Jewish Supreme Court, held a capital trial on the night of Passover. That is impossible. It would be like the U.S. Supreme Court holding a murder trial on Christmas Eve at midnight. Jewish law strictly, absolutely forbade holding trials on feast days or at night. Second, the Gospels have the high priest acting as the prosecuting attorney. But in the Jewish legal system, there was no prosecutor. The witnesses were the prosecutors. The high priest was the judge. The author has no idea how the system works. And finally, the idea that they needed to drag him to the Romans for execution? Nonsense. If Jesus had truly committed blasphemy under Jewish law, they wouldn't have called Pontius Pilate. They would have taken him outside and stoned him right there. Case closed. See St. Stephen. See James. Since the authors clearly didn't understand Jewish law or geography or customs, we have to conclude they were outsiders, likely Gentiles living decades later, writing fiction about a culture they didn't actually understand. So, if the earthly Jesus story is full of holes, if the trial is fake, if the witnesses are anonymous, where did the idea of Jesus come from in the first place? To answer that, we have to go back to the earliest Christian writings we possess. We have to go back before the Gospels. We have to look at the letters of Paul. Now, most people assume Paul preached the same story as the Gospels. We read the Bible as one big book, so we blur it all together. But when you actually read his letters, without filling in the blanks with stuff you learned in Sunday school, you find something shocking. Paul's Jesus has no biography. Paul writes thousands of words about Jesus, but he never mentions Jesus walking in Galilee. He never mentions a parable. He never mentions a miracle. He never mentions Mary, Joseph, or a carpenter shop. He never mentions a trial before Pontius Pilate. He never quotes anything Jesus said on earth except for the Eucharist ritual, which he explicitly says he got from a hallucination, not a person. So, who is Jesus to Paul? To Paul, Jesus is a cosmic being. He is an archangel, a high priest in a heavenly temple who was sacrificed in the celestial realm, not on a hill in Jerusalem. Paul explicitly says he received his information from revelation and hidden scripture, not from eyewitnesses. The earliest Christianity wasn't about a guy who lived and died on earth. It was a mystery cult, worshiping a dying and rising celestial god, similar to other savior gods of the time, like Mithras or Osiris. The biography, the manger, the fish sandwiches, the walking on water, that was all backfilled decades later by the gospel writers. They were trying to make their cosmic gods seem more concrete, more real. They were engaging in a process called euhemerism, taking a god and writing him into history as a man. Now, you might be thinking, Farid, this is a lot to take in. Even if the earthly Jesus story is a bit mythological, surely he's unique. Surely other religions have rock-solid historical founders. Nope. This is the kicker that blew Fitzgerald's mind, and it blew mine too. When you apply this same historical scrutiny to other major religious figures, Moses, Abraham, Buddha, even Muhammad, the evidence crumbles just as fast. This isn't a Jesus problem, it's a human problem. We have this pattern in human psychology. We invent the myth first, the perfect founder, the miracle worker, the lawgiver, and then we write the history later to justify the belief. Did you know that most historians now agree Moses never existed? The Exodus never happened. There is zero archaeological evidence for 2 million Jews wandering the desert. The evidence for the historical Muhammad is surprisingly shaky until long after his supposed death. Jesus isn't the exception to history. He is just another example of how humanity builds mythology. We create gods, and then we pretend they were men so we can relate to them. So, here's the final question, the elephant in the room. If the evidence is this weak, if the texts are clearly fiction, if the pattern is universal mythology, why does your history professor still teach that Jesus was a real guy? Why is this still the consensus? It's called inertia, or as Fitzgerald puts it, touching the totem. You have to understand that biblical studies isn't like other fields of history. For nearly 2,000 years, Western history was dominated by the church. If you questioned the existence of Jesus, you didn't just lose your tenure, you lost your head. That bias doesn't just vanish overnight. It is baked into the walls of the universities. Even today, secular scholars like Bart Ehrman, who is a brilliant guy by the way, still cling to the historical Jesus. But watch how they do it. They don't have hard evidence. Instead, they rely on hypothetical sources. They say, well, the Gospels are unreliable, but they must have been copying from a lost document called Q, and Q proves he was real. Do you see the problem? They are inventing a document that we have never found to prove the existence of a man for whom we have no evidence. They are inventing evidence to save the conclusion. Fitzgerald argues we're watching a paradigm shift in real time. The historical Jesus is shrinking. Every year, scholars admit more and more of the story is myth. First, the miracles went, then the trial went, then the birth story went. Eventually, that kernel of truth is going to get so small, it will disappear completely. So, where does that leave us? What do we do with this information? It leaves us with a responsibility. A responsibility to be honest about what we don't know. David Fitzgerald puts it perfectly. We need to be militant agnostics. When someone asks, did Jesus exist? The answer shouldn't be a polite, well, probably, but he wasn't God. The answer should be, I don't think so. And if you actually look at the evidence, neither do you. Because here's the secret that every rationalist needs to understand. It doesn't matter if there was a random preacher named Yeshua 2,000 years ago who got crucified for being a nuisance. If he didn't perform miracles, if he didn't rise from the dead, and if his entire biography was written by people who never met him, then the Jesus of Christianity is a myth. Either he was a regular dude who got turned into a god by later legends, or he never existed at all. In both cases, the Bible is wrong. In both cases, the dogmatic authority of the church rests on a foundation of sand. So stop letting apologists bully you with the idea that all historians agree. They don't, and the ones that do are usually just repeating a tradition they are too afraid to challenge. If you want exclusive content, early access to videos, and want to support this rational quest, consider joining our YouTube membership community. You become part of the family, helping us navigate this rich tapestry of ancient narratives. Until next time, keep delving, keep questioning, and stay curious.